Have you ever thought about what racism is? Where does it come from? And most importantly, how can we stop it all? We must define race. According to the NIH, National Human Genome Research Institute, race is defined as a social construction that is used to classify people. Race was built as a hierarchical grouping system for human beings, and racial classifications were generated to identify, differentiate, and marginalize some groups in different nations, regions, and the world. Races divide human populations into groups, often based on their physical appearance, social factors, and cultural background. Regarding racism, what can be inferred based on the text by Raul Bayar Navarro? The fundamental difference between racism and racial prejudice is that racism implies a global rejection of a group in which ethnic differences may be included, but which is united by religious ideas or national ties, while racial prejudice is limited to stereotyped ethnic traits. Currently, the issue of racism, the rights of the so-called minorities, how we can face this attitudes in society for a better future, etc., is very much by word of mouth. The issue of race and racism, based on the environment in which we surround ourselves, the friendships we form, the news and the documents we read, all tend to make visible this great problem that we have as a society. So, where does racism come from?
Reimagined.
Dr. Ken D. said in his exhaustive research he found what he believed to be the first articulation of racist ideas, and he named the culprit. His name is Gomez Days Arara, Portuguese man who wrote a book in the 1450s in which he did something that no one had ever done before. According to Dr. Ken D., he lumped together all of the people of Africa, vast diverse continent, and he described them as a distinct group, inferior and beastly. Never mind that in that pre-colonial time some of the most sophisticated cultures in the world were in Africa. Why would this guy make this claim? It turns out it helps to follow the money. First of all, Sir R.O. was hired to write that book by the Portuguese king, and just a few years before, slave traders here, we went slave traders tied to the Portuguese crown, had effectively pioneered the Atlantic slave trade.
Music licensing.
They were the first Europeans to sail directly to sub-Saharan Africa to kidnap and enslave African people, so it was suddenly really helpful to have a story about the inferiority of African people to justify this new trade to other people, to the church, to themselves, and with the stroke of a pen, Surara invented both blackness and whiteness. Other European countries followed the Portuguese lead in looking to Africa for human property and free labor, and in adopting this fiction about the inferiority of African people. I found this clarifying racism didn't start with a misunderstanding. It started with a lie. There is something called racial color blindness. Bonilla-Silva's ideology on racial color blindness is a perspective that criticizes the notion that we live in a post-racial society, where racial differences no longer matter. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva, a sociologist and social theorist, argues that racial color blindness is a way of denying or minimizing persistent racial inequalities and the power structures that perpetuate them. First, Bonilla-Silva argues that racial blindness arises from the idea that we are all equal and that racism is no longer a relevant problem. However, he argues that this perspective ignores the realities and lived experiences of people of different racial groups. Socioeconomic inequities, unequal access to opportunity, and racial bias continue to affect the lives of people of color.
Licensing
in addition,
reimagined.
Bonilla-Silva highlights how racial color blindness also manifests itself in the denial of the existence of institutional and structural racism. He points out that racism is not limited to individual acts of discrimination, but is rooted in social institutions, policies, and practices. Denying this reality makes it more difficult to address and correct systemic inequalities. The concept of racial color blindness also implies a tendency to minimize or ignore the cultural differences and historical experiences of different racial groups. Bonilla-Silva emphasizes the importance of recognizing and valuing racial and cultural diversity, as these differences influence opportunities, resources, and the treatment people receive in society. So, what's the main difference between being non-racist and being anti-racist?
Music licensing
Not being
reimagined.
racist and being anti-racist are two different positions that approach the issue of racism differently. Not being racist implies taking a passive position in relation to racism. It means not having racial prejudice or discrimination towards people of different ethnic or racial groups. A person who is not a racist may treat everyone equally and claim that they see no racial differences. However, this stance does not actively address racial inequities or seek to dismantle the structures and systems that perpetuate racism. There may be a lack of awareness about systemic inequities and the need to take action to address them. On the other hand, being anti-racist is an active and committed position in the fight against racism and the promotion of racial equality. It involves recognizing that racism is not just an individual issue, but also a systemic problem
Music
rooted in social
licensing
institutions,
reimagined.
structures, and practices. Being anti-racist requires being aware of racial inequities and working to challenge and change those structures. This involves educating yourself about the history of racism, recognizing inherent privilege and bias, and taking concrete steps to advocate for racial justice and equity. The fundamental difference between the two positions lies in the action and active commitment against racism. While not being a racist may simply be a stance of individual non-discrimination, anti-racism involves acknowledging existing racial inequalities and working to challenge and change the structures and systems that perpetuate those inequalities. Being anti-racist requires constant commitment and deliberate actions to advocate for racial justice and work toward an equitable society. So, how can we stop racism? Marilyn Frye once wrote, "It is only necessary to identify the active verb, ignore, in the word ignorance to realize that ignorance is not a passive state." At this point in the course, we all know that color blindness only chooses to deny or ignore the reality of racism. Consequently, we are proud to say that we do not look at race, that we are making an active decision to ignore something that has a profound social consequences. Maybe we don't actively discriminate, but we also do not rely firmly on the evidence for what it indicates that race is still important. Anti-racist writer Joseph Barnes says, "Non-racists deny that prison exists. Anti-racists are working so that over time the prison will be destroyed." Although we are familiar with the popular phrase, "I am not a racist," which is normally complemented by but we hardly know phrases like, "I am part of a racist society and I am working so that it is no longer so." Racial progressives recognize that racism exists and that societies still have an unfair structure. An anti-racist is a progressive who in addition, acts, not only recognizes injustice and supports initiatives to change it, but he works to achieve it and maybe even leads the social change movements. Anti-racists focus on the macro and micro levels of change in society. Those who act at the macro level may lead marches or organize petitions against racist policies, representation in the means or legal decisions, for example. It is possible that also engage in proactive levels of macro change, such as proposing a council for diversity on the school campus or that there be more diverse study programs. However, many anti-racists also focus on micro levels of social transformation. They may provide anti-racist training that invites people to analyze their own prejudices or biases so that they can confront them actively, both in themselves and in the people around them, in their daily lives. In the same way that there is individual and institutional racism, there is a need to have both types of anti-racist. Do not confuse the popular training in diversity or the days of multicultural celebration with racial progress or anti-racism. The diversity and multiculturalism often focus on the cultural level, share family dishes or customs, invite a friend to your celebration or religious gathering, or teach participants that Italians often speak with their hands. Latinos are more affectionate physically than African Americans and tend to speak louder in conversation. Sociological studies like the ones he read about in this module often show that the emphasis on the cultural level like these examples. At best, they create superficial and short-lived changes, but at worst, they can reinforce stereotypes about certain groups. Most anti-racist educators stress the importance of having curricula that impact racism, the inequalities of power and privilege that accompany racist systems, and the impact they have had on individual lives. This awareness also involves teaching about the history of racism, so that inadvertent errors of exclusion are less common. In the same way that racial progressiveness recognizes how its schools and neighborhoods grew on the basis of segregation, you can recognize how your own environment is influenced by these social forces and can create intentional techniques, such as diversity in the workforce, to deal with those barriers directly. The race was initially a human creation, so humans can undo it, but only with intentional, informed, and instructed actions. So what can we do as a person to be able to stop being non-racist and start being anti-racist? 1. Recognize your own prejudices and stereotypes and work to challenge and overcome them. 2. Listen and learn from the experiences and perspectives of people of different ethnic and racial origins. 3. Examine and change your own actions and behaviors that could perpetuate racial discrimination. 4. Support and participate in anti-racist movements and organizations. 5. Be an active advocate for diversity and inclusion in all areas of life, including work and education. 6. Fight for racial equity in access to resources, justice, and opportunities. 7. Support and value the culture and identity of racial and ethnic minorities. 9. Take personal responsibility to create change and challenge racial injustice. Thanks for watching.